Welcome, everyone. We're on our next podcast of season 1, episode 7. The first part is looking at the Voting Rights Act, Selma, and how Unitarians and Universalists supported or didn't support the movement. This episode, we're talking about the UU involvement in the civil rights era. First off, I will say that it is absolutely impossible to cover every nuance in these 2 short episodes from this part. That's the work of a lifetime. And it's my hope that in future seasons, I'll return with some other voices pairing up with me to take a deeper dive into different parts of the history. And I'm going to try my best to hold what we did well, what we did poorly, and where we didn't agree with each other. But I think it's best for this discussion of the civil rights movement for us to begin with some clarifying words or framing from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. MLK is one of those prophets who we as a nation have tried over and over to quiet how far his story gets retold the way he meant it. We remember his visionary speech about dreams that we can all find a place in and forget his more challenging messages, like this one. And I'll quote, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." End quote. He asked us to get uncomfortable. Or his reminder in the letter from Birmingham City Jail in 1963 that read, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." In that same letter, King would go on to lament that over the past few years, he says, "I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Those words are still true today, although what we would consider a moderate has moved somewhere on the scale of politics these days. Hearing his words travel ahead 60 years to today, it's 60 years this year, I think of all the protests over the last few years where, in one breath, pundits would extol MLK's calls for freedom, but pretend he didn't shut down roadways in Selma or demand desegregation in 100 public ways. It's another form of doublethink that's alive and well in our national conscience, and we need to nurture that healthy unease to it. And I'm going to ask all of us to kind of keep that center in your mind as we talk about the stories of the 60s today. With his voice centering how we think about our denomination's historical involvement, I want to begin with some stories I've heard from some of our leaders present at the time. This episode is going to be less about all the quick details you can find online, although we will have some resources that if you want to do a deeper dive but aren't ready yet to do more historical work, you can get that next step that might move you along the path if that's what you're looking for. But we're going to be focusing on first-hand accounts with, of course, some historical facts along the way that don't always get lifted up. So it's about 8 years ago now, I was in Selma for the 50th anniversary of the march that inspired the Voting Rights Act. I got to hear the stories from the people that were there. I've heard Selma veterans speak before, and they always open up parts of history that weren't always really taught in schools. Certainly not my Gen X generation. Everything stopped with the March on Washington as a sentence or two, and Selma a sentence or two. History tends to look at the biggest moments and the rest often blur in memory. One such time I heard a Selma veteran speak was about 11 or 12 years ago, and then I'll loop back up to the anniversary, when I attended one of our ministers' gatherings at our denomination's General Assembly. In this particular worship service, there are 2 sermons that are delivered, one from a minister in the 25th year of the ministry, and the second was a minister in their 50th year of the ministry. And that 50th year minister happened to be the Reverend Clark Olson. Olson was a minister of the Berkeley Fellowship of Unitarians, at the time of the Selma Civil Rights March in 1965, when he survived an attack that fatally injured another white minister, the Reverend James J. Reeb. This happening not a month after the shooting of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a black civil rights activist and the very reason for the march in the first place. I found this talk incredibly moving and remarkably humble of him, and the more I learn about history and my role as a white man, white cis man in all of this, that humbleness is incredibly instructive and incredibly helpful. I always imagine the folks who marched on Selma in this otherworldly light for being the folks that stood up for their convictions, who stood up for basic humanity in each of us. And certainly there were ones that were far ahead of the common view of the times, with some giving their lives, and we'll hear more about that. I marveled, though, at how everyday the decision was for this minister. He spoke about how he almost didn't even go. He wanted to, but the money wasn't there to make travel across the country. And that's reality. And then one of the congregants donated the money for Reverend Olson to travel and represent his congregation. It gave him the opportunity to stand witness and to be there for the last moments of his colleague and friend's life, too. But I don't even know the name of the congregant that made that possible. Unitarian Universalism often sees itself as on the right side of history when it comes to social justice. But we're still human, and we're far from perfect. And when I was in Selma for the anniversary, we heard more stories like this. Some congregations' boards would require their minister to attend. And sadly, some congregations would not approve of their minister going at all. To paraphrase the thinking of the time, why would the congregation risk its standing in the community by getting involved in other people's business or by challenging the perfection of government or the police force in Selma? It has echoes today to the Black Lives Movement. It has echoes today to police violence and brutality. It's still alive in our stories, and our congregations still sometimes make great choices, sometimes avoid choices at all, which are a choice in themselves. We can all imagine stories alive and happening today where people of good conscience come down on differing sides of a crisis for various reasons. I wonder when we come down on differing sides of a situation that folks on both sides may think it's crystal clear today, who will see it differently in another 50 years. And I mention this here because it'll be important later in this, in the next episode, when I talk about the Black empowerment controversy, as it's sometimes called. It's exactly the same sort of challenge, and it has a lot of echoes to what's happening right now. But to go back to Selma, I wonder how soon we can forget the role institutions and authority had in the violent deaths around Selma of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Reverend James Reeb, the 4 young girls in the church that was bombed, and there was a 5th girl that survived, and Viola Luiso. I recall Reverend Dick Leonard, one of the final 300 marchers who finished the 4-day march in Selma across the bridge, tell a story of the National Guard being present to protect the marchers. But he relates that for several days, and I heard him say this in the Selma 50th year anniversary, but he said for several days the National Guard were facing the marchers as if they were protecting Alabama from the peaceful protesters. They would eventually be convinced to turn around and face the trees with their Spanish moss and ivy, where snipers would easily be concealed. But that's not what they were inclined to do at first. And that's not a story I've ever heard in the books. And those roads were dangerous. Viola Luiso, a young Unitarian white woman from Detroit, was chased down car to car and tragically shot dead. This happened after the march, after she dropped some protesters off when everything was already over. She was just helping out and was chased down and gunned down on our roadways. Since I'm serving the Community Church of New York, and a lot of these events are also happening here in the city in a community church and around the same time, the early 60s, I want to take the liberty of briefly talking a bit about our history at Community Church and the Civil Rights Movement. But even in doing so, I'll still be highlighting the work of Black leadership. In 1962, 300 members of Community Church of New York took part in Dr. King's March on Washington. 300. And the same year, Community Church of New York hosts a debate between Malcolm X and Bayard Rustin. And we're going to, for those watching later, we'll have a link that you can watch this. And I'm going to say a little bit about the clip before we show it. It's a clip from Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin. 5 years in the making and the winner of more than 20 awards, Brother Outsider illuminates the life and work of Bayard Rustin, a visionary activist and strategist who has been called the unknown hero of the civil rights movement, a tireless crusader for justice, a disciple of Gandhi, a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., and the architect of the legendary March on Washington. Rustin dared to live as an openly gay man during the fiercely homophobic 40s and 50s and 60s. Brother Outsider reveals the price that Rustin paid for this openness, chronicling both the triumphs and setbacks of his remarkable 60-year career. And if you want to watch the whole documentary, you can get info to purchase it on DVD at www.rutin.org, and we'll have that on a slide later for those that are watching this later. But I want to show this because Community Church was a center. One of our UU congregations was a center for debate between the leaders in the wider movement. And this was moderated by our senior minister at the time, and it's between Bayard Rustin and Malcolm X. Well, we'll be reflecting on that video in a short bit. I just want to talk about two more events that happened at Community Church, or Community Church was involved in. And the next comes into 1964. Okay, so in 1964, Community Church's senior minister, Donald Harrington, is arrested alongside Bayard Rustin while picketing opening day of the New York's World Fair with CORE, Congress of Racial Equity. The protest demands included shutting down all World Fair construction sites until workforces were fully integrated, immediate rent strikes throughout slum areas, an immediate timetable for total desegregation of all schools, and a civilian-selected review board on complaints of police brutality. And you'll see in a slide the link to the New York Times article. As we're recording this today on April 16th of 2023, this event happened on April 23rd of 1964. So an anniversary is coming up in 1 week on the same time. And if you want to read the Times article, that link will be up there, and I recommend it. It's always instructive to see how the papers describe the event at the time, despite what might come up later on as stories are told or retold. And the last bit about Community Church, as far as this kind of timeline goes, will be 1965. Reverend Harrington, along with other liberal religious leaders, spent 17 days in Alabama supporting the Selma marchers. And I would love to go into more detail about everything with Selma, but as I said, again, there's only so much time in a podcast, and we'll be covering other parts later. But you can find a link that'll be on our slides and in our chat now to read more about our engagement with the events in Selma, and it's from the UU World, and it has a good range of the goods and the bads, where we were strong and when we were imperfect. And so if you're watching this later, or in a moment for those of us together, the reflection question I'm going to have for all of this is, if we are to retain our involvement today in justice movements, what lessons do we take from what we just heard about congregational leadership? So a few things that were just said on our end over here are, as congregational leaders, how are we aware of our connections to the wider systems of injustice? Isn't it our obligation to be involved in that as religious communities? Are we obligated as communities of faith to challenge structures of injustice as part of our core mission? I also, some other things that we could think about in our reflection groups are the role of lay leadership in these decisions as well as ministers. I mean, I talked mostly at clergy on the UU side, although on the ground there were certainly UU folks that gave their lives to just drive people, or there were leaders who funded others to get to places. Um, but what's the role of the board and committees and the minister in collaborating and following leadership of that's centering Black and Indigenous and people of color voices? I mean, this session is heavily going to be focused on Black and white, but that's only one part of the story of the civil rights movement. And there are some congregations that we heard about that centered their own concern and anxiety about their role in the status quo, as Dr. King talked about. Negative, a negative piece, which is the absence of tension, is not what our goal is, right? And a sense of obligation for our congregational leaders of showing up. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine 300 members of any congregation showing up to a protest, especially when that means you're traveling so far. That's pretty amazing. And that's a question as congregational members and leaders we have to ask ourselves, like, how do we stay engaged, and what does engagement mean? And in your groups now, if you want to talk more about those points, please feel free to. And so one more suggestion that I just heard from our group that's reflecting on this is really wise as what's our commitment or obligation or self-awareness around learning what we ourselves need to unpack with our own internalized structural injustices or our own internalized commitment to systems of oppression. And that even as time goes on and we grow, we might still react negatively to the next thing that comes up in every generation. In our next episode, we are going to be talking about the Black empowerment controversy, which is happening a little later in this decade and is an internal challenge to Unitarian Universalism. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you tune into the next one.